happy weekend. I am Allison, and we're here for Where I'm From 86. Maud will be joining me in just a moment. What have you all been reading? I have read Brace for Impact, a memoir by Gabe Montesanti. It's about her experiences in roller derby, obviously, but it is also about being in a community that's queer and accepting for the first time in her life, and also about her relationship with her body as a young athlete, which I related to. I didn't play college sports like she did, but I did. I was an athlete when I was so fraught because you are proud of all the things that you can do, but you're also being told to limit what you consume and limit what you do. And I just really appreciated that conversation. Hi, Maud.
Hi, Allison.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Sorry about the weirdness with the
That's
phone.
okay. It's kind of par for the course. You just have to roll with it.
Yeah,
You know, it's fun to be able to talk to each other in real time. So it's worth the strangeness.
it
But
is fun. And I see a friend of mine who lives
oh,
outside of Dallas on here. So that's kind of perfect with our
yeah.
Dallas Wichita Falls connection.
Yeah, I told Maud my husband's family is multi-generational Texan, and his grandparents lived in Wichita Falls and then outside Dallas, and his dad was from outside Dallas, Waxahachie, and so reading all of that, the book, it really made me think of them, and
I
they
love,
were always really sweet to me, so it made me feel good.
I love.
I love doing this because it's such a privilege to hear people talk about where they're from. And I read Maud's your book, Ancestor Trouble, and as I was reading it, I thought, oh, I'd love to have her on this series because I think your book speaks so brilliantly to where we're from, not just ourselves, but intergenerationally, our ancestors, how it does affect who we are.
I'm really glad it resonated that way for you. And that was definitely something that I was thinking about. Really, I've thought about my whole life in one way or another, and I hoped that the book would land that way.
It did for me, absolutely. And all the research you did, which will be reflected in your poem a tiny bit, especially the end, made me think of the research in your book. But I just, I was so impressed with all the research you did because it is not easy, like, to find those things out. And I wish I had a relative like you who would gift me, because I do know that I would feel those kinds of, like how you talked about in the book, these kind of moments of recognition, or like we feel mirrored by people we never knew.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And yeah, I mean, the amount of time I've put into it, as I write in the book, I thought at one point that I was just kind of wasting
Yeah.
time when I was, meant to be writing a novel, and then a lot of that just kind of ended up getting filtered into Ancestor Trouble. Now I am writing a novel, and it feels good to just sort of have that out of the way.
I think that happens sometimes, right, with our creativity. Like we have one idea of what we're going to be doing, but then there's something in the way or something that needs to be done first before we can get to the thing we think we should be doing
Yeah,
in life in general. Um,
yeah,
but it's and I think as I've gotten older, I've really tried to accept that nothing is wasted, you know.
definitely. Yeah. Well, let me know when you'd like me to read it.
I'd love you to read it. Go for it.
Okay, so hi, Jane. Um,
Hi, Jane.
so Allison had asked me to write a poem about where I am from, kind of based loosely around a template that she sends to all of her guests. So I will read what I wrote. I am from three cats, two dogs, the birds at the feeder, the coreopsis, and Joe pieweed I planted for pollinators, and the houseplants I can't keep alive. From Czech soda, and from the roach poison that coated the toaster at breakfast, while melting cheese rained down from the bread onto dying palmetto bugs. I am from an old house in Queens with vinyl siding, from a chain link fence and concrete deck that overlooks a tangle of trees and trash on a hill left by the Wisconsin Glacier, on land of the Lenape people that still sometimes smells ancient after the rain. I am from hibiscus, bright yellow with red stems, radiating sunlight along medians during Miami traffic jams. I am from a disciplinarian white supremacist father and a mom who spent more than 5 decades awaiting the rapture. From Lucretia and from Mary Bliss Parsons. I'm from a stiff way of walking and sudden addictive enthusiasms. From, quote, your ancestors were good to their slaves, end quote, and, quote, Jesus is coming back any day, so your math grades don't matter, end quote. I'm from the collision of decorous poverty is your own fault, Presbyterianism, and feverish tongues and exorcisms in charismatic storefront churches. I'm from Dallas, raised in Miami, a generation removed from the Mississippi Delta. I'm from pecan pies and Jell-O salad. From the Texan granddad I was told married 13 times, and his father, who killed a man with a hay hook and died in a mental hospital, and whose story turned out to be much different from what I thought. Thanks for that template. When I first looked at it, I was like, oh no, what have I agreed to do? But then I sat down and wrote this, and I enjoyed doing it. Yeah.
I think it can be freeing. It's based on George L. Lyon's poem, and then a man named Fred First made these templates, which have been widely disseminated, mostly in high schools and middle schools, but also in colleges and in work seminars and so you said your template a verse, right?
Well, that is I am from on my mother's side, sort of not really fitting into a scheme, a kind of reflexive aversion to formulas. Yeah. So, but sometimes it's nice to, to try. Yeah. So.
I enjoy it. I am from wanting to get A's and do everything right. So I see something and I'm like, okay, I can do this. I feel a certain security in the right way. The illusion that there's a right way still feels like comforting to me. So, it's interesting to see how different people react to it. And I get asked all the time, oh, do you want me to do it just like the template? Like, no, I don't. Like, it's a container that you can do whatever you want with. But it's such a privilege to get to have these conversations with people, because I realize as I grow older, people don't really talk about this stuff much.
I mean, I think one thing about writing Ancestor Trouble is that I've kind of attracted to myself now people who do like to talk about this stuff, and I've always been the kind of person who talks about it, at least in my adult life. When I was a kid, I was just kind of freaked out and trying to seem like less of a weirdo, I guess. But
me too.
As I've gotten older, I'm all about like, let's just be honest about it all. And a friend of mine used to say, "Where's the unicorn chaser, Maud?" When I would like just sort of lay out some really fucked up thing from my family past.
You do have a very I also have an interesting family, or curious, or whatever word you might use, but yours I feel like is so braided with the history of our country. But I think that's probably true of mine in a different way. But I think particularly with you reckoning with enslavement and
enslavement and the dispossession of indigenous people. and no doubt the killing. And yeah, I think probably all of our families are connected in that way, in
Yes.
one way or another.
Yep.
And yeah, the kind of deeper I got into the book, the more I really felt less alone in that way. Um,
Yeah. And I read something recently from someone saying, even if your family didn't in, actively participate in enslavement, or, we still benefit from redlining. As white people, we benefit from redlining and the GI Bill. And like, there are all these kinds of things that we benefited from, whether we were actively participating in the system per se. We're benefiting from the system.
yeah,
You know.
absolutely. That is definitely true. Well, do you want to tell me a little bit about your family before?
Um, hmm. Yeah, well, no Texans, but I grew up in Southern California, and I also related to her because I had this veneer of wealth, and this whole kind of idea. I think people are starting to have these conversations, but with wealth, there's safety, like in a way. The amount of dysfunction that can exist, nobody's policing those spaces, so
Right.
there's no pressure to conform in that way. And I knew a lot of kids who had it rough, and I did too. And I'm trying to talk about that more because I think it's important for people to understand that the way our child welfare system works is so classist and racist, and it's not about child welfare. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you imply, that's one thing I really write about in the book. How,
yeah.
I mean, especially when my parents were together, my father made a fair amount of money, he was a lawyer.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was just sort of perceived as, and it was true. I was, the child of a comparatively, like, fairly well off family. I mean, my family wasn't going to be in a, like, who's who of the richest people
No,
in
me
the.
neither. But yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, I had an immense amount of privilege, and then that kind of became a little more complicated when my parents divorced, and my mom's level of mental illness is like still only becoming clear to me now. Um, so that was, yeah, but I mean, if my family had been poor, I probably would have been taken away from my parents, at various points if someone had.
Well, if someone had reported you, I mean,
Yeah,
it just wasn't even in the consciousness of those spaces. I think there was just, and that's something that I've had to reckon with, that I needed to acknowledge that what had happened to me wasn't okay, because I was definitely getting messages of like, well, you're wealthy, you're white, you're good looking, you're thin, whatever. You've got the things. What could possibly be going on that would be bad? So
right,
that was something I had to reckon with. Like, obviously, you can't play the like trauma compared game. It
right.
doesn't benefit anyone. You just need to deal with yourself.
To the extent that we don't um, acknowledge how messed up these families are in a lot of cases, families like mine or families like yours, where there is this
Mm-hmm.
veneer, um, of something that other people might want to aspire to. I think we perpetuate a myth of this, whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
this privileged whiteness as being something uncomplicated and great to aspire to. So I think, yeah, like transparency in all things, really. And yeah.
Well, and how you talk about in your poem this idea that being poor is a moral failing,
Right.
as if there's some relationship there when
Yeah.
there is not.
Explicitly something that my father
Mm-hmm.
uh, held. And in fact, I kind of like mentioned the Presbyterians, and they were sort of on board with that, but he even freaked them out by once like refusing to allow me to go to the projects and deliver food, at Thanksgiving or something,
Mm-hmm.
because of his belief that it was a moral thing, you know. So, I mean, but as I write in the book, I'm kind of glad now. I mean, I'm not, but I am in a way glad that he was so extreme
Yeah.
because I didn't have the ability that a lot of people have to just kind of pretend that it was fine and
Mhm.
unsee the harm that my family has, done to people over, hundreds of years. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to put it because I think that if you were a different person, you could unsee it. Like that's what I've come to realize. Like, I mean, because certainly I'm not in agreement with my siblings about what transpired or what it was like for me or for any of us. And maybe because I'm the only girl and there were four older brothers and I felt very outnumbered and unsafe. And that might be why, I don't know. But I, people's ability to want to protect what they believe is their piece of the pie can be very compelling. You know, this idea that there is a pie and there's only so much to go around, and this kind of scarcity capitalist model and white supremacist model.
Yeah, no, that is true. Um, and at the same time, I do think that because it was so prominent in my childhood that my father literally advocated for slavery.
Right.
Literally,
Yeah.
it,
It's just, yeah.
it was much harder for me to
Mm-hmm.
pretend that my family didn't have that history, you know.
Right.
Um,
Right.
Whereas I think, as I also write in the book, like on my mom's side, um, I didn't expect to find that history. And then when I did find it there as well, that my ancestors on my beloved, like poor Texan granny's side, that some of them had also enslaved Black people, I realized that the signs had been there all along, you know,
Mm.
that I hadn't wanted to see it, you know. So I can see how that can happen, really easily.
And there's so little conversation around it. It's just, I feel like your book is so timely because I feel like with the pandemic and with George Floyd's murder and the uprisings, like the whole idea of white supremacy, I really I feel like it hit a lot of people who'd never thought about it before. Like they really just thought about it as the KKK, you know, something that we can kind of partition off and say, well, I'm not like that, so this isn't for me. And
In when I started writing it in 2014, which was, I
yeah,
had been working on essays that were kind of connected to it for a long time. But I kind of, my editor told me to start with my father. And I sort of thought, like, okay, I see how structurally and emotionally that makes sense. But also, like, historically, readers have found him, like, repellent as a character. People
mm,
often don't really even see an entry point
mm-hmm,
into racism. I didn't say any of this to her. I just thought, like,
mm-hmm,
okay, I'm going to do it.
mm-hmm,
And then it was interesting because when Trump became president and Jeff
yeah,
Sessions became the attorney general and all of this, white supremacist sort of thinking that had been sublimated was suddenly right out in the open.
yeah,
Uh, I was like, oh, I mean, I knew it was there,
mm-hmm,
um, but now, wow, here it is, like right out in the culture. So it's really just like an accident of it taking me so long to book, really, that it arrived at a time when maybe a few more people were ready for it. But I think there are still plenty of people who are comfortable wagging fingers in a sort of general way, but
mm-hmm.
have more difficulty looking at their own family's complicity, in these, historical systems and systems, that we're all continuing today. So,
Yeah. And I will say that I felt like those conversations were happening more a year ago than they are now. You know,
yeah. Yeah.
like you can feel that kind of like I don't know if it's a backlash, but you can just kind of feel how it ebbs and flows. Like you feel like,
Yeah.
oh, this is really in the consciousness. People are talking about this. And then, and for me, it was, I mean, there was a lot of awakening, which I think was true for a lot of people, but there was language for these things. Like it just felt like it was just much more in the zeitgeist. It was something people were talking about, and people didn't recoil when I was like, let's talk about racism, you know, because
Yeah.
so many people, white people, I just don't even want to engage with it because it's just so unwieldy to them. Like you say, it's hard to find an entry point. I think the reason they couldn't find an entry point with your father was because it's in a similar space.
Right.
It's like, well, this isn't about me, you know.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, he is a very particular person.
Yeah, I mean, so well drawn by you, of course. But I also just felt that sort of that narcissist sort of mania, which I think if any of us have had a person like that in our lives, maybe they don't take that form, but it's just this relentlessness.
Yeah. Yeah. It really was relentless. And I mean, I should say, I don't, as far as I know, he hasn't been diagnosed with anything.
Sure, this is me doing an armchair diagnosis based on reading your book.
Right. He, as you might not be surprised to hear, he's pretty anti-therapy.
Right.
Psychologists and psychiatric testing. Is He doesn't want any part of that. So.
No, I'm sure not. My father was also a lawyer, so all of that too, just the kind of how you can get engaged in these conversational, just circular, you know, it's just there
Yeah.
are just certain things that, and that's kind of what's fascinating to me and has been so helpful to me as I've gotten older, because when I was younger, I definitely felt like I was the one having the conversations. And I sort of felt like, particularly when I was younger, it was like people pitied me because I was talking about things. And then as I've gotten older, I've found a lot more community.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's so true. There is a sort of level of judgment um, around talking about family dysfunction. And I think, like, one of the gifts my mother gave me is just a sort of like uh, blitheness around that, just as sort of, you know, my mom has always been, um, she's always almost been entertained by this sort of like level of extreme messed upness of her family, you know. She loves a tall tale. One of her favorite things to do even now is talk about how awful my father is, and I don't think they've spoken to each other in like 3 decades. So, you know, that's obviously not healthy, but it is a sort of example that was set for me
Yeah.
of being transparent around things, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah, she's not hiding it. She's
Yeah,
not being, you know, quiet, in shame about these things. And my mother also talked a lot openly about things. And so I had that modeling as well, that like when you lock things away, because I, like you, had two examples, when you lock things away, you know, they don't go anywhere. They're still just locked up there. But I did definitely have to find my sort of way forward,
yeah,
where,
absolutely. Well, I
which is like,
don't talk too
yeah.
long because I know, yeah, so I don't want to keep you, although we could obviously talk.
I love talking about this stuff. And reading your book, I was just blown away by the depth of research, and obviously the writing's beautiful, but it felt like an important book to me, like
That
to
means
bring these things up.
I really
Yeah.
like that, and I feel really committed to just sort of like continuing. It
Mm-hmm.
was just like as far along as I could get at that point, but
Right.
I part of my life's work as like continuing to reckon with my family and to encourage other people to be transparent. So that was
Yeah,
really.
and to be open-minded and about like when people discuss reparations, you know, like,
Oh yeah.
oh, let's, you know, because I think that it does tie into that. And sometimes reparations can feel so vague or not, like they can't engage with it. And I think a book like yours helps people understand like what that means and why and how it has affected. Like reparations are a drop in the bucket, but
Right,
a
right,
good
right.
drop in the
They
bucket.
are a good drop in the bucket. They don't mean that, white people suddenly get a, you know, like you're forgiven and
Right,
everything time card,
right,
but they are, one
right.
step that we can take.
Yeah, because action is really important
Yeah,
and appreciated, and there's not that much of it in the world
yeah,
that is acknowledging what was taken and the price of that. So,
yeah. Especially in this country, I think, you
yeah,
know, there's a real resistance, and maybe even more so in England. Um, so,
yeah, it's interesting. With I know we need to wrap, but with the coronation, it's like they're still doing that.
oh yeah, absolutely. And
Wow, that's still going on. Okay, really?
yeah,
So,
and on the one hand, you see like California coming forward with the reparations task force and
yeah,
a plan, and then you see like, yeah, as you say, the coronation in England, following on the heels of the unsurprising news that Charles is descended from,
sure.
and Virginia enslavers, not surprising,
No,
but yeah.
yeah. So but I just appreciate you, and I appreciate you taking the time to join me and writing your poem, and it's
I'm
lovely to meet you. So,
grateful to you for inviting me. Thank
mm,
you for having me and keep in touch.
okay, I
Okay.
will. Thank you, Maud. Thank you for everyone who joined
Thank
us.
you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.